let's get into business. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share my screen with you. Hopefully you can all see that. It's the opening slide, Caring for Your Head. And we'll go through these. And I have 50 slides, and we'll go through at a pace that we can end right at 5 o'clock. I promise you that. And so I just wanted to, and if you can, how many of you are administrators? How many of you are heads of school? Are any of you heads of school? Okay. And just raise your hand if you are a trustee of a school. Good. Good. And others, may I just ask who else is with us? If you are not any one of the other categories. Don't forget to unmute yourself if you're going to speak up. All right.
Hi, I'm Lisa LaFord. I'm a trustee. I'm a chair of the Board of Trustees at Emma Willard.
Oh, okay. Good. Hi, Lisa.
Nice to meet you.
And one of the things that I want to commend to you, and I'm going to be giving you a lot of resources along the way, but something that can get your attention really gently is by this novel called Saying Grace. It was written about, probably close to 7, 8 years ago by Beth Gutchin. And it is a wonderful book about seeing the inside of what it's like to run a school and to be a head of school. And it's just enjoyable reading. It's just a great read. And the author's husband ran a school on the West Coast, and that's what she bases the novel on. So that's the first of many resources that I'm going to pass on to you.
Sorry. That sounds like fun. Really fun.
So the different things we're going to cover during this next hour are establishing standards and expectations, trust building, compensation, measurement, leadership and professional development, and resources. And as George may have said to you, or he will close by saying that I will share these slides with you in PDF format so that anything that you don't capture while I'm going along, you'll get the whole deck of slides so that you can see that. And I have, especially for the resources, I think it will be helpful to you.
Super.
Also, as we end each segment, I will pause and ask for questions. And at that time, it'll give you a chance to ask questions to the group. And hopefully that will be helpful to you. And I will unshare my screen so that I can, for during that time, and then I'll go back to sharing my screen so that I can see everybody and see whose hand is up to answer the question. So one of the things you might want to do, hopefully you'll be able to share what you experience here today, but you will be able to, since it's being recorded, you will be able to show it to other people. But one of the things I always ask people that I'm speaking to is to make a list of action items, things that catch your ear, things that is not being done presently at your school or for your head, and just write them down so that you can recall them after, especially when you're talking to other people. And then the reading list, again, any of the resources that I'm recommending to you will be a part of this PDF. So the very first thing I want to point out is that there are 4 anomalies at work with the board-head relationship. And forgive me for reading as I go along, but because some of you are on phone, I want you all to be able to hear what is being projected. But there are 4 anomalies at work with a board-head relationship. The first one is that the board or the owners hire, fire, and is responsible for the care of its only employee. And oddly enough, it is the head who ultimately provides the guidance and care of the board, a group of volunteers who give up their precious time to hold the school in trust. They are the owners of the school. The second one is, I've got to reduce my thing. Because these volunteers have other responsibilities, in other words, families, sometimes children and aging parents, jobs, personal needs, and financial obligations, the last thing on their minds is the care of someone who is the leader of the school, often one who holds distinction and admirable status within the entire school community. Heads are no different. Their needs are similar. They have families to care for, personal and professional needs, and financial obligations. The third anomaly, heads are charged with devoting huge amounts of time, professional time, caring for others, students, teachers, and parents, and they often find themselves guilt-ridden for not dedicating the same amounts of time to their own children and families. And then the last one, contracts between head and school need to protect both parties, which is a perplexing way to do business. Trustees, or the owners, are the fiduciary for the school, and at the same time, so is the head. A word on this from former head and longtime, now retired executive director of the New York State Association of Independent Schools, Fred Calder. I love this quote. Obviously, massive contracts do not doom the headship, but in not so subtle ways, they are monuments to distrust. And unless a school and head will have it no other way, simplest is probably best. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on when we get into compensation. So actually there's an article that goes along with this presentation, which will be made available to you, Caring for the Head. And when I was writing the article several years ago, I asked heads of school 2 questions about their board experiences. The first question is, what's the one thing you wish your board did better in caring for you? And these are some of the responses that I received. Share trustee expertise more so I don't have to prompt or dig for it. Do not take for granted what I do. There's not enough recognition. Limit the number of goals. Understand that my job is like a minister of a church and understand the time commitment to the school. Make choices based on the mission and the strategic plan rather than going off on other tangents. And balance board composition with parents and non-parents. The next question I asked was, what is the one thing your board does well in caring for you? Responses were, trustees are supportive with difficult decisions. I have an excellent board chair. Generally speaking, it pleases me when the board performs well. I am compensated well. I have access to my board chair. And the board periodically reconfirms its appreciation and belief in me as a head of school. And these were from heads of school in the New York system, the New York independent school system. So, unlocking why we do what we do and what is the right way. So often you hear the term, well, that's best practice. But what is that based on? And I always like to, the groups that I speak to, I like to bring up some of the essence of where best practices should come from and the rules of the road that we need to follow, both as boards and as heads of schools. So here's how I believe we arrive at best practices. There's research and data, resources, related professional organizations and networks, and standards. And I'm going to touch upon each of these 4 pieces. First of all, One of the biggest is the standards and the NYSAIS manual for evaluation and accreditation. So every 10 years, our member schools, full members, they go through an accreditation process. George and Judy Sheridan know this very well. They guide us through that. Us meaning the evaluating team and the school. And it's in this manual for evaluation and accreditation. If you're not familiar with it, it would be good to get a copy, because section 2 of this is devoted to governance. And criteria 2.10 talks about the governing body delegates responsibility for the operations of the school to the head of school and ensures that the head of school receives appropriate support, evaluation, and compensation. This is one of the standards that needs to be met in order to be accredited or reaccredited. So one of the things that boards can do, and heads as well, is to set the table, to have good governance and good care for the head. And I use the term setting the table from this book by Danny Meyer. If you're not familiar with Danny Meyer, he is probably one of the foremost restaurateurs, certainly in New York City and maybe throughout the United States. He's the one who has the Shake Shack. He's the one who had Union Square Cafe and the concession for MoMA. And this book, that was handed to me about 8 years ago from one of my trustees, who said to me, Dane, I think you'd really appreciate this book. And he talks about the care of employees and how important it is. And if you are going to serve your customers in a restaurant, you've got to take care of the employees first, so that they are the ones who will take care of both the customers that come into the restaurant and also the vendors to the restaurant. So very important, I think, has great significance in the way we run our schools. And it's about care for families, and certainly its bottom line is the care for the children. Excuse me. Here are, I'm going to throw some data out at you, and these are taken from the National Association of Independent Schools survey. And does the board set annual goals for the head? 69% of the boards, independent school boards, say yes, they do that. There are 31% out there that don't set those goals, and that's too bad, because goals are important to give to a head every year. And those goals, and keep the number under 10, because if there are too many goals, like one of the heads said in the previous slide, is that, there are just too many things that the board is asking of me. So keeping those goals limited. And an important thing, folks, is that you don't look at those goals at the end of the year and start asking or measuring whether the head has met those goals or not. One of the things I often recommend is that in the first or second board meeting of the year, the head should give a synopsis of the previous year: finances, financial aid, number of hires, number of fires, number of students in each program. This is something that lays the groundwork so that we can see the goals, which should be based on the strategic plan. And then in the spring, then it's time, the early spring, you look at the goals, and the head reports to the board on how she or he is doing on those goals at this point. So there's still some time for the board to say back to the head, listen, these are the ones that are really important right now, and these are the ones we want you to concentrate on. This might be an opening to the head's goals and objectives that I got from one school. Set forth below are the major goals of the head for the year 2015-16. These goals are derived from and concordant with the goals of the 2013 strategic plan, now in its third year. Underlying each of the 2013 strategic plan goals is the need to continue to enhance our financial stability through fundraising and institutional advancement efforts. Therefore, as an overarching goal for the head, we have established institutional advancement as goal number 1. That's one example. So, establishing the board's expectations of the head, proper monitoring of the performance along the way, and formal annual evaluation with proper monitoring of performance along the way. Oop, that's the second one, sorry. I put that in just to emphasize that we do it along the way as opposed to the end of the year. So you have your mission, and within that mission is a strategic plan that's done, say, roughly every 3 to 5 years. And you develop an annual board agenda based on that strategic plan. And that rolls into developing the head's goals and objectives. And by the way, this is done over the summer. Ideally, you want the executive committee of the board to do this with the committee chairs, with the head in the room, and developing them together. Now, you started out, it's best if it started out with the board chair and the head working the first rough draft. But you want to make sure it's shared with the executive committee, and then eventually the board votes on adopting these heads, goals, and objectives. And then eventually you're going to get to the evaluation. And often evaluations, and I'll show you an evaluation, it's called the head assessment tool from BoardSource, that ties in the head's goals and objectives into the evaluation to give the head feedback on how she or he is doing. And then the process starts all over again the next year. Here's an important document that I want you to look at, because what it does is it ties in the head's goals and objectives, the head's evaluation, and ultimately the contract. So just take a minute to look at this, and I'll describe it to those people who are in with us by phone. Essentially, you're looking at the goals and objectives, the target date when it will be done, and then you record the accomplished date. Then under that is the evaluation, the instrument that's used, when it's introduced, when the evaluation is done, when, say, the executive committee reviews the evaluation with the head, and then when the board goes into executive session to discuss the results of the evaluation. And then you also keep track of the contract. One of the contracts I like to talk about is the contract I used often with my board, or my board used it with me. And that was a 2-year contract that's renewed every year. A 2-year contract that's renewed every year. What this does is it protects the school and it protects the head. So at the end of year 1, you go to renew the contract again. That still goes for another year. If the head decides, I'm leaving, she or he is obligated to give the board a year's notice. At the same time, if the board decides that it no longer wants to offer a contract to the head, the board is obligated to give the head a year's notice. It works best both ways. And as Fred Calder said earlier, the simpler, the better. So here's a time I'm going to stop sharing my screen when this section is done and ask if anyone has any questions.
Again, if you have any questions, all you need to do is unmute your microphone and speak, and we'll hear you.
I know it's a lot to receive, and it's hard to process it when it comes so fast. Most ideal, when we could get together, this presentation might take 2 or 3 hours, and back and forth, back and forth. But it's better to give it to you than to not give it to you. But
Excuse me, Dan.
Can you hear me?
Mary, go ahead.
Oh, yes, I have a question.
Go ahead. Not hearing. Are you not hearing? Mary Beth, do you have your hand up?
think Steve might have something.
Yeah, actually, Dane, my question was more when as far as you talk about goals and objectives, we are talking about school's objectives or, I'm sorry, the head's objectives. Are we talking about sort of personal growth as well as school objectives?
It's a good question, Steve. It really pertains mostly to school objectives and how the school is going to achieve the various goals of the strategic plan.
Okay, all right.
Rather than shooting, starting out the year with the first board meeting and you're shooting from the hip. Okay, what's the next brush fire that we have to put out, or what the next issue is? You lay these all out so that the head knows exactly what is expected of her or him. But good question.
I understand.
Yes, Suzanne.
I wanted to ask, will you be talking more about the evaluation for the head?
Yes, a little bit farther on, I'm going to be a little bit more specific. Yes, I will. Okay, I'm going to go back to sharing my screen and we'll go to the next section. So the next section is trust building. And I bumped into this book this summer when I listened to a speaker who is a psychologist and conflict resolution. His specialty was conflict resolution, and he recommended this book. His name is Jamie Notter, but he recommended this book, Emotional Intelligence 2.0. And it talks a lot about trust. And one of the quotes from the book is that trust is something that takes time to build, can be lost in seconds, and maybe our most important and most difficult objective in managing our relationships. I think every board should read this. Every head of school should read this. As a matter of fact, the board that I am on right now, we are buying a copy for every member of the board. We are going to read it, and when we meet in March at our next meeting, we're going to take 45 minutes out of the board meeting to do an exercise in terms of processing this book. It's a very easy read, and you're going to read it and you're going to say, oh yeah, of course. But you will often reflect upon yourself, do I do this? So one of the things that I point out in the book is, how is trust built? 1, open communication. 2, willingness to share. 3, consistency in words, actions, and behavior over time. And reliability in following through on the agreements of the relationship. But building trust with emotional intelligence, to be in tune with each person in the room, the social awareness strategies. And here are a few of the 17 that the author lists. Greet people by name. Make timing everything. Watch body language. Practice the art of listening. God, how many of us don't do that, especially in our conversations? I have become so aware of this whenever I'm in a conversation with someone. I almost have a stopwatch wondering, all right, how much am I talking and how much am I listening? And how much is the person I'm talking to listening and how much is he or she talking? And you will find the disparity. And the more you become conscious of it and the more we become conscious of it, especially as we as heads and we as trustees talk to one another, it's better when it's a 50-50 deal. As a matter of fact, I picked up on this from George and Marcy in their Emerging Leaders, the 10 top tips that I absolutely love. I won't go into that now, but it's so your wisdom goes through a very famous published book, George. And step into their shoes. Always be thinking about what the person you're talking to is saying, why they're saying it, and try to take on their perception of it. And then catch the mood in the room. And don't just get angry and just blurt out. See what the mood is in the room, and then present what you have to say unemotionally, because it will be received much better. So Emotional Intelligence 2.0. And one of the things you want to do, you're doing all of this, folks, especially at board meetings, is you're preparing the environment so all can speak. And this is part of what a generative board is about. And Governance is Leadership, written by Dr. Richard Chait. Kathy Trower is a protege of his, and she wrote the Practitioner's Guide to Governance as Leadership. And what Dick Chait talks about, there are 3 modes of governance. 1 is fiduciary, 2 is strategic, and 3 is generative. And essentially, what generative talks about, and she has a quote that I've taken from her book, observations over the years have revealed that the prevalent practices of many nonprofit boards optimize the following: task efficiency rather than process efficiency or effectiveness, congeniality, conflict avoidance, and harmony rather than collegiality and rigorous debate. By the way, just for clarity, you want the latter. So you want collegiality, but you want rigorous debate. Convergent thinking rather than divergent thinking. You want people coming in from all aspects, and then it's up to the board and the head to come together in consensus, but not because one person has told everybody this is the way it's going to be, or gives a smirk or a look like, what are you thinking about when you say that? You want this divergent thinking if you're going to be generative. And then lastly, fiduciary oversight more than strategic or generative insight. So often boards are thinking about the finances, which they should, but above and beyond the strategic and generative insight. Board Source is a wonderful resource. If you don't know of it, it's something that you want to just Google it, and you'll find that it is probably the foremost resource for nonprofit boards, not just schools, but nonprofit boards. And mechanisms for building trust, incorporating a culture of positive dissent in the boardroom encourages board members to share opinions and accept counter comments without turning issues into personal conflicts. Second, regularity of executive sessions removes secrecy from these meetings that allow board members to openly and in confidence discuss internal issues without staff present. We'll talk a little bit later. And then regular KPOM. It's an acronym for Keeps the President Awake at Night. Meetings provide a safe, trusting environment for the chief executive or head of school to share personal and position-related challenges with the board. So here's a statistic from NAIS. Does your board hold executive sessions? 90% said yes. Back in 2006, it was still 90%. And the idea of executive sessions is without staff, and it's without the head of school. But the key is that essentially executive sessions are held at 2 different times in the year. 1, to discuss the contract and compensation of the head of school, and 2, to discuss the evaluation of the head. The last thing you want to do is to have the board chair go to the head, say 2 days before the next board meeting, and say, hey, Franny, we're going to have an executive session just to talk some things over. If you want your head of school to lose 2 nights of sleep, go ahead and do that to her or him. It has to be predictable. Executive sessions have to be predictable if they're going to be effective and if they're not going to break down trust between the board and the head. Why does your board hold executive sessions? So 83% are heads evaluation, 52 are sensitive legal issues. And generally, the head would be there. This kind of executive session would probably be without the business manager or without the development director or somebody else. Determining confidential budget line items such as salaries, setting tuition, other 25%. So again, what we're trying to do with this data is to try to build trust because it's based on data as opposed to what someone says because she or he has been on the board for the last 7 or 8 years. And of course, everybody listens to Sam. The annual Chief Executive Performance Evaluations allow honest feedback and assessment of achievements under fair conditions if they are based on mutually agreed upon goals. Here are those goals again. Board self-assessment builds trust and confidence among board members as a collective effort to judge how the team is working together. I'll bet now if I ask how many of you did a board evaluation last year, I'll bet you less than half of you will raise your hand. If you don't have a governance committee or a committee on trustees that's taking care of the board, you must start that right now because the functions of that governance committee are 4. One is to recruit and nominate board members. The next thing they do is that they conduct the annual evaluation, self-evaluation of the board. The next thing they do is they take care of succession planning, which is something so important to boards. But we always wait, inevitably, we always wait till the last minute when the chair of the development committee says, I'm done, I've had enough. Or the treasurer of the board says, this is my last year. You will be grooming people along the way. The fourth thing of governance committee, the fourth responsibility is the ongoing professional development of the board. We don't think about the board needing that. And particularly with boards, because they're all volunteers coming from many different places, which is a good thing, we all need that kind of professional development as a nonprofit board. Also, on the other hand, heads caring for their bosses, no surprises. Heads have to be in communication with their heads, with their board chairs particularly. If the trust is going to be built, there can be no surprises. The board chair or any trustee does not want to hear out on the drop-off line or when a boarding school is having its board meeting, someone to come up from the faculty and drop a bomb. No surprises. Staying ahead of meetings, making sure that the agendas are being built. And it's the head of school who should initiate this agenda and putting it together and sharing it with the board chair. And then the board chair is working with the committee chairs to bring those pieces of the agenda together. And then there are the ABCs of care, abundance, buoyancy, and clarity. And these come from Daniel Pink, who wrote the book, To Sell is Human. And when we're selling and when we're trying to pitch something, maybe ahead to his or her boss, you want to make sure you are in attunement with the board, the school's needs, and what is going on. But you also want to present it with the glass half full, being buoyant about what you're trying to capture the board's attention on, and being very clear, whether it's a slideshow, whether it's a one-page document, you want to make sure that you are clear. Again, the book is To Sell is Human by Daniel Pink. Here's something that I did a few years ago, and I asked several consultants in their work with heads and boards, what % of the head's time should be spent caring for the board? When I share this statistic with heads of school, they look at me like, are you nuts? There's that anomaly again. You know, the board is my boss. They should be taking care of me. No, you are the expertise. You have the expertise on how nonprofit boards should work. And it's not unusual for a head of school to be spending 30% of his or her time taking care of the board, setting things up, and being the person who invites the business manager to a particular board meeting, to have that information and to have the structures and the systems in place. And then also, heads want to make sure that the creature comforts are taken care of. So if your board meetings are the second Tuesday of the month and they're at 7 o'clock, why not have people have a meal there, if you don't already do that, at 6 o'clock so people can come rushing in from their jobs, grab a bite to eat, and sit down for an hour and a half. And if your board meetings go longer than an hour and a half, now sometimes they are needed to take longer, but generally you want them down so that if they're an hour and a half, people will be less reluctant to say the week before a board meeting, hey, you know, I can't make it. I've got another meeting. When I started my job at Brooklyn Heights Montessori School 14 years ago, the board meetings would start at 7 and they had a lunch, they had a meal there rather, and we would finish by 1 a.m. And it was just brutal. By the time I left, I had some really good board chairs. By the time I left, they were down to an hour and a half, no more than 2 hours. So we've got to take care of those creature comforts for our volunteers, our board members. So we're at the end of that. And let me ask, I'll stop sharing my screen. Any questions? Yes, Suzanne, take yourself off mute.
Okay. It sounded like you said the head sets the agenda for the board meeting. Did I understand that right?
Yes, would come up with the first draft. Good, thank you for asking that. Would come up with the first draft. But it's really to get the board chair set. And because the head goes to every meeting, and that should happen, whether it's a development committee meeting, a finance committee meeting, task force on strategic planning, whatever ad hoc committees you have. So the head is the conduit for all of these things and can be the one to lay the groundwork for the agenda. But ultimately, it's up to the board chair and, say, the executive committee to set the agenda.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Any other questions? Okay, we'll go right back. Now we're in compensation, and very quickly, notes for your consideration to think about. You want to have comparables, very important. And you get these comparables from GuideStar. And because GuideStar is a nonprofit organization that posts every nonprofit, mostly every nonprofit's 990s. And the 990s are the documents that boards have, nonprofit boards have to file each year. And it has to show the salary and basic compensation for the top 5 highly paid, most highly compensated employees. So being aware of these comparables is important. Now, sometimes you can't match them, your school can't match them, but at the same time, you want to be aware of them, not only for the board's sake, but also for the head's sake. The self-analysis and reporting, using outside data, like from NAIS and BoardSource and various reports from other organizations, to just keep pulling in that data, and that helps in credibility in a significant way. Also, the use of a consultant periodically. You know, that governance committee or the trustee committee, part of their job is the professional development of the board. And the best way you can do that sometimes is to bring in an outside perspective. I know that at my school, what I would do about every 4 years is bring in a consultant to do a survey, to do interviews with all these employees. Because, and this would be a task force made up of the board. So it would be a task force on compensation and benefits. And essentially, it would include some staff members. It would include the business manager. The task force would be chaired by a board member, by a trustee, and the treasurer would be on that. just to look and see how are we doing, rather than waiting until you haven't done this and you've just had a successful capital campaign raising $2 million and none of it is earmarked for the faculty and staff. So by doing this ahead of time, going out there and having someone, an independent consultant, come in and gather that data, and you basically want to do it on 3 areas. One is compensation and benefits. You also want to do it on professional development. How much professional development are you offering the faculty and staff? And then the last thing you want to do is look at the work environment. Ask the faculty and staff how they feel about the work environment. Is it conducive? Do I want to come to work each day? Do I have a place to go and work when I don't have a class or when I'm not feeling well? Doing this ahead of time, it sends a huge message to the employees of the institution. And you want to make sure that this work is all the comparables that you're looking at and how you're going to compensate your head of school is relative to the employees. Relative. So let's look at the next and who is responsible for this. Well, let me go back to relative to the employees. You don't want your employees getting 3% pension, a match, a 3% match, and your head of school is getting a 6% match. Medical insurance. You don't want the head of school getting all benefits paid and then your staff gets 25%. Same thing with remission of tuition. Now, obviously, the compensation is a different story because the responsibility that a head takes on, he or she needs to be compensated fairly. Now, who's going to be responsible for the comparables for all of this? Well, somebody has got to be responsible. The head can help in this, but ultimately, you want the treasurer, the executive committee, and the board chair to do this. Because if the head has to do all this grunt work, it diminishes, I think, it diminishes the value of the head. Yet at the same time, if the head is used effectively, it can be done in a way where trust is not eroded. Compensate with confidence. Here's a book from BoardSource, and it says right in the first paragraph, according to Leading with Intent, at least 1/4 of nonprofits are lacking some critical steps in setting compensation. 25% of boards do not use data from comparable organizations. 35% of boards do not approve and document the decision-making process. So keep that in mind as you think about this. So when we talk about compensation for the head of school, we think about benefits, and in those benefits, we think about medical benefits, pension, life insurance, housing, car, deferred compensation, and remission of tuition. Also, again, you want to make sure that not necessarily all of this, for example, for housing and for the car, and even deferred compensation, the other employees probably are not going to be involved in this. But there are certain things that are commensurate with the job of the head of school, especially in a boarding school in housing, that, you know, gather the information and see what's fair and see what's reasonable. And recognition, something that doesn't cost anything. And this is as much for the head of school as it is for the board to recognize the head. The head of school really needs to take the time to say thank you to his or her employees, especially to the staff, the service providers. It means so much to get that recognition. So how can boards give recognition? Caring can be the best kind of compensation. Just by asking the head of school, what's on your plate, periodically. And you remember the acronym, no, I can't remember it, but the acronym, well, what keeps the head awake at night? Just being sensitive to that. And when the head describes his or her plate looking like that, you want to be there to hear, to listen. And you go back to the emotional intelligence and that's when you need to be a good listener. Any questions? Mary Beth, is that a hand? Okay, it looks like a foot or a hand over there. Anybody else? We're getting there. We've got 10 minutes to go, and we'll have you out of here in time. So I'm going to go back to sharing the screen. So one of the notes on measurement when we do measure our head of school, you want it to be separate from the contract. The contract is one thing, but the evaluation is more of a professional development device in giving feedback to the head. And you want to do it with dignity. So the head should be in close communication with the board chair, but then to sit down, once the evaluation is done, to sit down with the executive committee. And then eventually, when the head sees the results of the evaluation, it's in front of the full board, but the board talks about it and asks questions of the head. That's perfectly legitimate. But then when that is done, that's when the board goes into executive session to dive deeper into the evaluation. Excuse me. And doing this with dignity and doing the measurement with in a dignified and systematic way, it's an infrastructure for building trust. One of my all-time favorite authors is Patrick Lencioni. And if you have not read him, and I've got all his books in one of my slides, it's just, he's the best. And he's a consultant to basically to for-profit institutions, but so much of what he talks about applies to any large organization, whether it's for-profit or not-for-profit. And one of his books, he talks about the 3 signs of a miserable job. What are they? One is anonymity. If someone goes to work each day and no one even knows he or she is in the job, whether it's a teacher, whether it's a head of school, not good. It dignifies the miserable job aspect. Irrelevance. Does my job make a difference to the organization? Whether it's the head, whether it's the director of admissions, so important to make sure that the relevance is there. And the head in consultation with, say, the executive committee, if things aren't going well, how is especially important. So establishing the head's evaluation, this I pulled from someone's bylaws. And the board shall review the performance of the head from time to time during the term of the agreement, and the executive committee of the board shall conduct and present in written form a formal review and performance of the head no later than April 15th of each year of the term of this agreement. I'm sorry, this is not from the bylaws, but it's from the head's contract. Does the board formally evaluate the head's performance? The survey said 93% of the schools do. 6% don't, and 1% said they didn't know. Hope that's not your school. And then how often does the board evaluate the head's performance? You can see here, once a year, 87%. If your board is not doing that, it needs to be part of that 87%. So here is a great instrument, and it's from BoardSource, and it's called an assessment tool. And essentially what it does is it sends, this is between BoardSource and the board chair, not the head. It's an evaluation of the head, but the head really doesn't get involved in it. And BoardSource sends out the instrument, takes about 45 minutes to complete. And essentially what it's doing is it's looking at the goals, but it's then looking at, if you can see on the diagram, it looks at the goals, the planning, the administration, the board relations, fundraising, and the top part is how the head, in this particular instrument, this sample, is how the head evaluated himself or herself. 1 being the lowest, 5 being the highest. And right below it is an array of how the board members evaluated on the same topics. And you get a sense of how that works. Ideally, I guess you want to see them together, but then this document is probably 15 pages, and it goes into each of the various areas and keeps doing the comparison between what the head did in the self-evaluation and what the board said. Excellent, excellent tool. One more time. Any questions? Okay, then we're going to go back to one more. It's 5 of. We're getting there. And stability markers. Now we're talking about the head's professional development, leadership and professional development. These are really ISM, is independent school management. And these stability markers for schools that are stable, they have strong executive leadership, but also they have strong board leadership. These are notes on professional development. I'll keep going. Some more. There's one here that I want to get to. Self-care for the heads is so important. Heads have to look after themselves by joining various organizations and being in touch with the network. And to get onto campus and connect with others, critical. An interview I did with Ned Hollowell, a leading psychiatrist, child psychiatrist, in independent school, and he said, leadership in this article, Leadership for All the Right Reasons, is the head has to find someone to worry with, spend time with children, teaching, reading, coaching, etc., and then also devote time away from school. Some more principles of good practice. Simon Sinek's Start With Why, an excellent book. I'm not going to go into questions because I'm going to run out of time. We'll see how much time we have at the very end, if that's okay. Selected resources. George is going to make available a PDF of this slideshow. And he's also going to give you an article that I wrote for NAIS's Savvy Trustee that was published about 3 or 4 years ago called Care of the Head. And then these are other articles that I've written over the years that will be made available to you. And this is how, well, here are some more resources I'll show you. I've given the links to you in a slide. So here are some more resources for you. Here are all of Patrick Lencioni's books. I've read them all, and probably the most popular is The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. But the one that I find most fascinating is the book that's titled Getting Naked. And that really is about a head or a leader, a CEO, making himself or herself vulnerable and helping a board becoming generative by being vulnerable, by being able to take good criticism. But the number one article that I commend to you is How to Keep Your Head, Great Schools and Long-Term Headships. This was written back in 2002 by Albert Adams, who was a longtime head at Lick Wilmerding in San Francisco. And it is by far a fabulous article in terms of how to keep your head. And it still pertains to today in 2015. So hopefully you have a list and you've got this reading list. And here is the list of those articles. And because in a PDF, it's not as easy to put in live links, what I've done is I've shared the HTTPS, the URL, so that you can copy and paste them. So all of these articles will be available to you and to whomever you share this with. And I've also left you my email. If you have any questions that come up along the way to follow up, don't be afraid to do that. And I also have a blog that's been going on for quite a while. That's about teachers, parents, and children that you might find interesting. So now I will stop sharing, and we've got 2 minutes if anybody has any questions to end. Hey, is anybody sleeping? You're not sleeping, are you? Okay. Okay.
Well, are there any questions while we have Dane on the line? Anyone curious about any of those resources or any of those topics that Dane brought up? Well, excellent. Dan, let me be the first to thank you so much for sharing all of this wisdom and expertise with us. As Dane mentioned, we will be sharing the presentation slides that Dane used today in the event that you might like to look at those again or share them with your trustees, fellow trustees, or head of school, or just friends that you know that would find that useful. I will also send a link to this video recording, which will be posted as well on our NYSAIS-Now website on the NYSAIS page. And I'll send you Dane's contact information should you like to get in touch with Dane. I know that he would welcome your contact. It is dane@nysais.org, but I'll include that in the email. So thanks so much, everyone, for taking an hour out of your afternoon. I hope you found this to be helpful and will help to make your schools even stronger. Take care, and thank you again.
Thank you,
Be well.
George and Andrew. Appreciate your support.
Thank you.